Hello and welcome to The Agenda. I'm Stephen Cole. As the Global Biodiversity Summit COP15 finally gets underway, albeit in virtual form only for now, we'll examine how we can build a shared future for life on Earth. Pressure to save the planet? We'll speak to the woman in charge of the summit, Maruma Mrema. Plus, under threat, we'll talk to the Director of Science at Kew Gardens about the state of the world's plant life. And a story of success, why the giant panda is providing a beacon of hope for the future of life on Earth. The biggest biodiversity summit in over a decade has been disrupted once again because of the COVID-19 pandemic. As a result, COP15 will now take place in two parts, a virtual gathering starting on October the 11th, and then it's hoped an in-person summit in Kunming in April 2022, nearly 2 years after it was originally due to happen. The agenda, though, remains similar, with plans to discuss targets of conserving 30% of the world's oceans and land by 2030, introducing controls on invasive species and reducing plastic pollution. Officials insist they can agree ambitious plans to transform our relationship with biodiversity and ensure that by 2050 we attain a shared vision of living in harmony with nature. It all sounds good in theory, doesn't it? But just how realistic are the goals? Last year, the world was stunned when the United Nations reported that world leaders had failed to meet a single biodiversity target agreed in Aichi in 2010. And that just can't be acceptable this time around. The scientists claim that now humans are causing the 6th mass extinction event in the history of planet Earth. And at the 2020 World Economic Forum, business leaders said biodiversity loss was the 3rd biggest risk to the world in terms of likelihood and severity, behind only climate change failure and weapons of mass destruction. The forum delegates put their concerns about biodiversity ahead of infectious diseases, terror attacks, and interstate conflict. And perhaps that's not so surprising. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Red List report for 2021 showed that 28% of all assessed species on the planet are threatened with extinction. Joining me now from Chengdu in China is the person in charge of COP15, the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, Maruma Mrema. Elizabeth, the last time we spoke, you hoped to be holding COP15 in Kunming now. Instead, that's been once again delayed. The discussions will be online, with a full summit delayed until next year. Can the world really afford these continuing delays if they're going to make true progress in protecting biodiversity?
Clearly, as you may know, we are dealing with an unprecedented situation. We need to balance the need to advance our work, as you are saying, but also at the same time, we need to ensure the safety of all the delegates who are expected to attend the meeting. That is why the Secretariat has continued to work hard with our parties and other stakeholders to ensure that our work continues through a variety of online discussions and negotiations. And this way, we've been able to maintain momentum on the importance of biodiversity issues. Of course, we cannot go on with business as usual with regards to how we are damaging the environment. And the last 18 months have been anything but business as usual, but we have adapted to it. The Conference of the Parties will be a great opportunity, both to governments and other stakeholders like indigenous peoples, local communities, NGOs, the youth groups, business, financial sector, banks, etc., worldwide, to engage with us in consultations, in online discussions, dialogues, as well as negotiations.
What do you personally want? What do people around the world want to see from Kunming? And second question, is what has been achieved since 2018.
Personally, what I want to see coming out of Kunming, one, there will be a Kunming declaration, and within the declaration is again the underlining political commitment on the importance of biodiversity and the need for the global community to take actions to hold and reverse biodiversity loss. So we hope these commitments will enable the world to lead us to the next part of the Conference of the Parties, which will then adopt that 10-year and long-term framework on post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So getting that, again, commitment in support of biodiversity agenda will be my key expectation. And also we hope that declaration will recognize the importance of biodiversity in human health and mainstreaming biodiversity in decision making. So all this then will revamp that commitment in support of the biodiversity agenda.
And what has been achieved since 2018?
Since 2018, you know, we expected the COP to meet after 2 years, which would have been last year in May. And the main work of the convention had been now, one was to take stock of what has been achieved in the last 10 years in terms of implementation of our strategic plan for biodiversity and the 20 Aichi biodiversity target. And that led us to produce a major report on the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5th edition, which unfortunately concluded that none of the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets were met, although about 6 of them, only partial progress had been made. And actually some of them even went backwards instead of forward. So that had been the measure. And it is the result of this outcome in this report which is informing the development of the new framework.
So does that mean last time round perhaps your expectations were too high? And does that mean in Kunming you will change your expectations in terms of setting goals?
I will say personally, yes, expectations probably were high, but the infrastructure put in place for the implementation of the Aichi targets and the strategic plan were not commensurate with that expectation. So we have learned lessons, and these lessons now have been taken on board in terms of doing things different as the new post-2020 framework is being developed. I may give few examples. Much as we are talking the last decade or implementation of the plan and the Aichi targets was to be implemented for 10 years, which ended December last year. In practical terms, actually it was just half a decade or 5 years. Why? Because most countries took a step back, began review, updating, and developing national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And that consultative process took 4 or 5 years. And actually many countries, by the time they began implementation, was a delay of 3 or 4 years. And that's why I'm talking practical was half a decade. 1, 2, it was also expected that the implementation was the responsibility of governments. We may know that today, biodiversity cross borders. You cannot deal with biodiversity issues just depending on the government without the engagement of all other stakeholders. You need the indigenous peoples and local communities. You need the women, you need the youth, the business, the financial sector, all stakeholders. So the new, in terms of developing the new framework, it took that approach of all of government, all of society approach into that development. So there had been a number of consultative processes which have taken place during this period of COVID. And that's what probably the positive aspect of the COVID has been, the additional time it gave us to prepare for this tangible framework.
Elizabeth Maruma Mrema, many thanks for joining us on The Agenda.
Thank you very much.
Still to come here on The Agenda, learning the lessons of the giant panda. We'll hear how to get a species off the endangered list. Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to The Agenda. Pollution, climate change and deforestation are all having a devastating effect on the world's plant biodiversity, and ways to tackle this must be top of the agenda at COP15. I visited the Royal Botanical Gardens in Kew here in London, which recently took the world record for the largest collection of living plants at a single-site botanic garden. There are examples of almost 17,000 species there. I met Kew's Director of Science, Alexander Antonelli, and asked him about the true scale of the crisis and what can be done to solve it.
Unfortunately, we are facing a huge and unprecedented crisis. We are talking a lot about the climate crisis and the challenge that humanity is facing, but at the same time, we have now about 2 in 5 plant species threatened with extinction, a number that we at the Botanical Gardens in Kew have come up with by examining what are the current threats to species today. And worldwide, about 1 million species that could go extinct over the next few decades.
Which species face the biggest threat?
There are many species now that are just on the brink of extinction. We're working with our partners in Madagascar, and many of the trees they use there for their livelihoods are now just about to disappear. And that's a problem that you can see anywhere. Even in the UK, we have trees which have very small populations now, but it's a really global phenomenon, both on land and in the sea. I mean, a common species that many people recognize will, of course, be the rhinos, but in the plant world, there are many, many orchids, for instance, that are threatened. And that's what we are seeing around us here today. It's a fantastic collection of orchids, many of them threatened with extinction.
And what are the threats to species in the UK and, of course, Europe?
Climate change is one of the threats we see in Europe.
So it's not just climate change?
It's one among several, and actually it's not the most important one. Although climate change is a major concern for societies, it's actually the change in land use that is really the major driver of extinction and risks to species today.
So it's land use?
It's basically the conversion of forests into agricultural land, something that has been going on for a long time, but especially since the 1950s, this period we call the Great Acceleration, where basically human population skyrocketed, and at the same time there were major increases in population in the countrysides and production of food. So it's basically transforming, cutting down the forests in the tropical countries, but also around us, and this has led to a major threat to many species which were dependent on those forests.
We've got 2 big conferences coming up, Kunming and COP26. What do you hope these conferences will achieve?
So there have been previous meetings and there have been previous agreements. For the past decade, we had something that were called the Aichi targets that covered the period between 2011 to 2020. And the problem is that the targets were actually pretty good, but we didn't meet any of them. And my really hope for the COP15, the Conference of the Parties in China next spring, is that we'll both have ambitious targets, but we also have a concrete plan of how to achieve them. And that's really about the commitment from nations around the world to pursue those targets and make sure that we don't fall into the same mistake as we did last time.
And that's the real problem, isn't it? You can set targets, you can set dates, but how can you force governments or companies to achieve them?
That's a really good question. Of course, it boils down to the interest and willingness of our policymakers and politicians to really invest as much as is needed now. We know it is going to be expensive. We know we need substantial increases in funding today in order to achieve some of those biodiversity targets. But at the same time, we need a commitment and a plan that is going to work in each country. So it's about finding the mechanisms by which there'll be a legal enforcement of, for instance, how much of our land can be protected. We are talking about an ecocide, a massive destruction of ecosystems now, and that language needs to be clear in those agreements as well.
China wants more from the international community to back a moratorium on biodiversity. Is that likely? And do you support China's attempts at biodiversity?
It is a good intent. I applaud the leadership of the Chinese government. I think there's a unique opportunity now for China to play a major role in leading those discussions, but also holding our leaders accountable. And I think what is really needed here is a document which shows the urgency of the challenge we're facing today. I think some of the language in that document doesn't really clearly convey the scale of the crisis now. So we need to talk about mass destruction of ecosystems. We need to talk about mass extinction. We need to talk about potentially ecocide. So holding leaders around the world accountable for the massive damage to ecosystems. And what really is needed now is both protect what we have left, but also restore some of what's been degraded so far.
And what as people can we do? Not governments, not companies, but individuals. What can we do?
You're right, we all have to be playing a part in this. It's not only about politicians making decisions and then individuals going on their normal lifestyle. So we all have to see a transformation across all levels of society. It's about the consumer choices we make. Every day we go to the supermarket. What do we buy for food? Are we contributing to the deforestation of the Amazon or destruction of natural habitats? It's about what we buy in terms of furniture, in food. It's about the choice we make for our children in terms of pollutants and chemicals, pesticides. It's also about what's happening in our schools, in our councils, and the pressure we can exert on them. And then, of course, companies and the private sector can also lead change. And of course, the political willingness and the framework by which people will be rewarded for doing the right thing, and they'll be punished for doing the wrong thing.
And you also mentioned 3030. What is 3030, this new proposal?
So there's a big proposal now that people are calling 30 by 30. So 30% of the world's land and oceans to be protected by 2030. And I really appreciate...
9 years away, this is very close deadline.
It's very close deadline, and I appreciate the ambition. We are far away from that number right now, but I think it's very important to think about quality rather than just quantity. So it needs to be the right 30%. It needs to be land where those species that are threatened today can really be protected. And we also shouldn't move away from the fact that some areas are officially protected. Those are called residual reserves sometimes, but in practice there's a lot of deforestation and unsustainable exploitation of resources going on. So we need to be effective in the areas already protected, and we need to choose very wisely the new ones that we want to protect. And that's something we're doing at Q. So we're working in countries such as Cameroon in West Africa, where we've been working with partners to identify what are the hotspots of diversity that are most threatened. And by this, we actually changed the government's initial decision to actually cut down some of that forest concessions to protect it instead. There's a beautiful forest called the achievable forest, where there were plans of development there, but we, showing our data from plans, we could actually make the government understand how valuable those forests were, so that development and agricultural practice could be done elsewhere.
What happens if we don't achieve the targets?
Well, we're basically shooting ourselves on the foot. We know that if we don't do that now and wait 10 years, it's going to be at least twice as expensive, and we will have lost many, many species, and some of those changes are irreversible. We're seeing that with climate change and biodiversity loss. Once large areas of forest are gone, it's much, much more expensive to restore them afterwards than to protect them now. So I really believe that the next 10 years, so this decade, and the decisions that will be made next year in China are possibly the last window of opportunity we have. I believe that if we don't act now, over the next few years, there won't be anything left, basically. And it will be too late. And we know that many ecosystems, they pass a threshold, a tipping point, after which they cannot revert. So this is really, I believe, our last chance.
Professor Alexander Antonelli, many thanks for joining us on The Agenda.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
We've spoken about plants, but biodiversity obviously also includes the world's animal population, and the outlook there is equally alarming. The latest figures from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature suggest that more than 28% of the world's assessed species, that's more than 38,500 species, are currently threatened with extinction. Here with me to discuss that is Professor Wei Fuwen, Executive Vice Chair of China's Endangered Species Scientific Commission and Principal Investigator at the Chinese Academy of Sciences Institute of Zoology. Professor, you've worked with giant and red pandas for many years, and in many ways this is now a real success story. How has China managed to get pandas off the endangered list?
I have been studying the giant panda and red panda for over 30 years. I have been traveling the giant panda in the wild in different mountain ranges, such as Qingling, Mingshan, Chungnai, Liangshan, Xiangli. As you know, the giant panda is a big mammal with a very specialized bamboo diet. Conserving this kind of species is challenging. However, with the joint efforts of government, international organization, and the scientists, their survival status has been improved. This is an exciting story to make in the international community for the biodiversity conservation. Our government has done a lot to conserve this charming species, including banning the poaching, establishing 67 natural reserves, restoring habitat, conducting breeding and reintroduction project. And the most important, I think, to achieve the advanced scientific research to provide science-based conservation management.
I wonder if there is a possibility now of being a victim of your own success, because now that the panda is not considered endangered, and therefore their numbers will hopefully increase, you'll then lose funding, perhaps lose attention, and then the panda could become endangered again.
Well, I don't think so. The giant panda's down list of its status means this once endangered species is in recovery, but does not mean that there are no threats to this survival. For instance, they are still facing habitat fragmentation. The small isolated population in Xiangling and Liangshan mountains are still endangered. If we suddenly withdraw conservation inputs, it can go back to the endangered list. As we alarmed in our previous paper, I don't think our government and the international community know this fact. I believe there will be more proactive solution for conserving giant panda and other wildlife in the future.
Do you think the world puts too much focus, too much effort on one single iconic animal? Or do other kinds of species benefit from this kind of, celebrity status?
It's always asked the question. My answer is no. We must be aware that conserving the giant panda is not panda itself, but also ecosystem the panda and other species rely on. This is why we call it embryo species or flagship species. Regarding to this concern, several years ago, we evaluated the ecological input and outcome to conserve panda and its habitat. Results show that protect the panda and its habitat yields about 27 times the cost of maintaining the current habitat. It should be a big outcome. Moreover, we protect and restore panda's habitat. It will also benefit other sympathetic species such as the golden monkey and the turkey, and its ecosystem service provided such as clean water, fresh air, or natural beauties will also benefit to our human being.
What would you like to be decided, Professor, at the virtual COP summit this month?
I'm so glad and honored to be invited to attending this big event. The theme of this COP is ecological civilization, building a shared future for all life on Earth. Under the construction of ecological civilization, China has made great achievement to protect our biodiversity and environment. I wish our experience on the ecological civilization construction would provide an example for other countries facing the same problem. I also expect the output of this summit would be the milestone in the history.
Professor Wei Fu Wen, many thanks for joining us here on The Agenda.
Thank you.
That the world is facing a biodiversity crisis is no longer open to question. As the United Nations has put it, nature is declining globally at a rate unprecedented in our history. So never has it been more vital that world leaders come together to tackle the issue. By now, the decisions taken at COP15, which should have happened a year ago, should be well on the way to implementation. But instead, thanks to the pandemic, we have a two-part conference, virtual now, in person in Kunming in April next year. It may not be ideal, but we have to hope that this delay in a face-to-face decision-making gathering may actually benefit the world. As Elizabeth Maruma Mrema told me, the delay has allowed for all stakeholders to gather in online meetings to come up with real solutions that can be debated and agreed in person in Kunming next year. She admitted that expectations for the biodiversity goals set in Aichi 10 years ago were too high, goals of which not a single one has been met. And that is something that the planet simply cannot afford to repeat in Kunming. So these virtual pre-meetings should allow all stakeholders to come up with plans which can make a real difference, but more importantly, can actually be achieved. And there we can look to China and the giant panda. Once on the verge of extinction, now it's off the endangered list, thanks to genuine government interest and investment in the very latest research and technology. It's a lesson governments around the world need to learn when they speak virtually now and gather in person in Kunming next year. As Alexandra Antonelli says, Kunming represents a last window of opportunity. It's our last chance to save the planet. Don't forget you can watch everything from past Agenda episodes and find additional exclusive content on our website, cgtn.com/Europe, or on our YouTube channel. And of course, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, @CGTN Europe. Coming up on a future agenda, fueling the future. Is hydrogen the solution to a greener tomorrow? But for now, from me, Stephen Cole, and all the Agenda team here in London, it's goodbye.